going to go ahead and jump in because I definitely respect your time. I know that you got some other stuff that you're doing today.
Yeah.
So happy Monday. Thank you for being here. And thank you everyone for joining GER today for our lunchtime talk with the amazing Professor Dorothy Roberts. First and foremost, we are recording this. We will share this out a little bit later. And GER, if you don't know, Grandmothers for Reproductive Rights, we are a group of elders and grandmothers that are lifting our voice around reproductive justice and reproductive rights across the country. And so thank you for being here with us. First and foremost, we're going to do this great introduction and give Professor Roberts, I've been knowing her for years, give her her flowers. Dorothy Roberts is the 14th Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor and George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology at University of Pennsylvania, with joint appointments in the Department of Africana Studies and Sociology and the Law School, where she is an inaugural Raymond, Pace, and Sadie Tainer Mossell Alexander Professor of Civil Rights. She is also founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society and a MacArthur Genius Fellow, an internationally acclaimed scholar, public intellectual, and social justice activist. Dr. Roberts has written and lectured extensively on the interplay of race, gender, and class inequities in U.S. institutions and has been a leader in transforming thinking on reproductive justice, child welfare, and bioethics. She is the author of the award-winning Killing the Black Body, Race and Reproduction and the Meaning of Liberty, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, and Torn Apart, How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World, as well as more than 100 scholarly articles and book chapters. Other recognitions of her work includes elections to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophy, I can't say the word. I was like going to get to one word and mess up. Society and the National Academy of Medicine honorary doctorate degrees from Rutgers University, where my daughter graduated from, and the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, Time Magazine, The Closers List, Society of Family Planning Lifetime Achievement Award, Juvenile Law Center Leadership Prize, and the American Psychiatric Association Solomon Carter Fuller Award. So yes, that was a mouthful, and I was trying to make sure I didn't mess up anything. And I first encountered Dr. Roberts as in my work as the executive director of the Chicago Abortion Fund. And during the time that I started the Chicago Abortion Fund, I was beginning my undergraduate degree. And so your writings played a very big role in my scholarship and my research, particularly Killing the Black Body. And so that was very instrumental. And then I went on to, the Fatal Invention and just so many dynamics. And I'm just really grateful to obviously know you, but also just be in your presence and really learn from you. And so thank you for being here. Thank you for agreeing to do this lunchtime chat with us. I know your schedule is extremely busy. And so we want to kind of open this up for you to just kind of take it away, share what it is you want to talk about. We will have questions that may pop up in the chat section, and we'll filter them out.
Okay.
And then we will let you go for your appointment after that. So thank you for being here.
Oh, my goodness, my pleasure. And I'm so glad that we have reconnected and to find out that you are leading this great organization, GER. And I'm so happy to be able to join you today. So, we should have checked to make sure I could share my screen. I hope I'm
You should
uh,
be able
okay, a
to,
host. It says send request. Oh, I'm a co-host now. Okay. That's this happening uh as we speak. Okay, let me I'll share and then I'll put it into the right mode. There we go. How does that look?
yeah.
Is that okay? Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it, but it looks like it, okay, now it looks like it's in, I think it's in the right mode.
Okay. It's probably a little delay, I think, again, because of I'm getting all sorts of messages here. I'm just going to look at my slides anyway. Because of the delay of my internet, I think maybe it was a little slow, but it's okay now.
Yeah. Good.
Okay. Okay. You know what? Also, I'm going to just click out of my email because that might be taking up energy. All right. So I'm going to talk about all of reproductive justice. And what I mean by that is an approach to reproductive justice that takes into account all that reproductive justice is supposed to cover. And I think sometimes we still think of reproductive justice as just meaning the right to abortion, which of course is crucial and important, but there are other aspects of it as well. And I want to talk about the relationship among those different aspects today. So, as I said, of course, the right to abortion is and important. It should be front and center of our concerns among all the other concerns, mounting concerns we have today. But we know that with the Dobbs decision and the overturning of Roe versus Wade, the decision that for some reason that makes absolutely no sense, there's no protection to reproductive freedom in the Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th Amendment in particular. That has changed the landscape of access to abortion care in America, with many states either absolutely banning abortion or restricting it severely, the equivalent of an abortion ban. And then other states that permit abortion to be affected as well because there are people fleeing from these compelled birth states, I call them, into free states to get abortion care and overwhelming the services that were already inadequate. So this has definitely been an earth-shattering decision that is affecting the lives, you know, absolutely literally of millions of women in this and capable of pregnancy in this country. But I
Professor
want to
Roberts,
also, yeah,
Professor Roberts,
yes.
can, can you put your, can you put this slide, can you put it into the slideshow? Because what I'm seeing, it looks like
Oh,
I
you're
see stuff at the
seeing not,
bottom. It's not, I
okay,
don't,
let me
it's not in the
see.
slideshow
New
part.
slideshow. There. Does that
Yes,
work? I
yes.
pressed something
Yep.
that said use slideshow. Okay, thank you. All right. So thanks for catching that sooner than later. Okay, so um, let me bring in another aspect of reproductive justice that is being violated today, also affecting millions of people in this country, through a story about one family, the Denier Mercado family, who were traveling along a highway in Florida in August of 2021 when the sheriff's department uh, pulled over representatives, sheriff's agents, armed agents, pulled them over and demanded that Ms. Mercado turn over her baby daughter, which you could see in a bottom image there, to these caseworkers that had accompanied the sheriffs. And you could see her there crying, screaming, "Why are you taking my baby? She's perfectly healthy. She's breastfeeding. What are you going to feed her? Who's going to care for her?" And everything she said was absolutely right. There was absolutely no finding that she had harmed this baby, that there was anything wrong. But the armed officers forced her to turn over her newborn to the custody of caseworkers. Now, why would something so horrific happen? Well, because when she was pregnant with the baby, she had taken her toddler, you could see him in the upper left-hand image, to the hospital because she was trying to transition him from breastfeeding to solid food, and he wasn't having it. And so she was concerned that he was losing weight, and she went to the hospital to get some help. And instead of helping her, the hospital staff called the child abuse hotline on her and alleged that this toddler was failing to thrive and it was her fault. They immediately took custody of the toddler from her and charged her with medical neglect. And so now, when her baby is born a few months later, the judge who was in charge of the case issued a pickup order, as it was called, for the sheriffs and caseworkers to take custody of the newborn baby, despite any evidence at all that this baby was being harmed, and actually in spite of evidence that she hadn't harmed her son to begin with. And I tell this story because it reflects so many key aspects of the system that we usually call the child welfare system or child protection system. I call it a family policing system because of these features. Number one, it targets Black families, like this family. Uh, we know today that half of Black children in America will be subjected to a child welfare investigation before they reach age 18. Half of Black children. Black children are at risk more than any other children in this nation, except for Native children. Both those groups are at very high risk of being removed from their families and at high risk of having their parental, their relationships with their families terminated permanently, or termination of parental rights. Also, the involvement of armed police officers. It is not infrequent that caseworkers bring along armed police officers to investigate families and to forcibly remove their children from them. And then the fact that these child removals, both of them were based on allegations of neglect, not physical or sexual abuse. And the vast majority of children who are removed from their homes and placed in the foster system are there on grounds of neglect, which means simply by state statutes that the parents have failed to provide some material need for the child. It could be medical care, as in this case, but it could also be clothing, it could be housing, it could be education, it could be food. Those are the main reasons why children are placed in foster care. And those reasons are almost always entangled with poverty or some reason why the parents were incapable, unable to provide those things. Either they didn't know how to do it or they didn't have money. In most of the cases, it's because they can't afford it. Most of the children in foster care are from impoverished families. And so the neglect their parents are charged with is almost always related to poverty. We're not talking about parents who deliberately, to, refrain from giving their children what they need. It's usually struggling parents who are trying to, but they don't have the means to do it. Now, reproductive justice, oh,
No, I just want to make sure that the slides were advancing. I see it.
okay, yes, yes. Reproductive justice from the very beginning has encompassed the violation that happened to that family, because from the very beginning, we have said that reproductive justice includes the human right both not to have children and to have children, and also to parent them in safe, supportive, and sustainable communities. So policies that punish or discourage people from having children, and policies that wrongfully interfere with their ability to parent their children are violations of reproductive justice. Now, I want to talk about how these violations are all connected to each other, and to emphasize that we should see reproductive justice as including these human rights to not have a child, to have a child, and to parent your child. And one way of showing how they're connected is how they all are rooted in resistance to the institution of slavery. In other words, the justice is rooted to abolishing slavery, and the injustice, all of these injustices, the violations of those human rights, were all essential parts of the slavery institution. So, of course, during the institution of slavery, Black women's reproductive labor was a source of profit for enslavers. And so, controlling, attempting control to control their reproductive rights, I should say they had no rights under the Constitution at that time or law at that time, but uh, controlling their ability, their autonomy to their reproductive lives was an essential part of the legal structure of slavery. And uh, part of that was the ability of white enslavers to separate families at will and to claim that they had legal authority over Black people's families. And so children could be sold away from parents at the auction block, and often were, and they could be separated from families that were living on farms or plantations. Uh, it's been estimated that half of families, once the the ability to import enslaved people from Africa ended, half of Black families during the slavery institution were separated at some point. And this was considered the major sin of slavery at the time, as this image from abolitionist literature shows. What appealed to people to end slavery, and what formerly enslaved people testified about before Congress to get the 13th and 14th Amendments passed, was the way in which slavery broke up their families. Images like this of Black mothers pleading not to sell away their children were very common during the abolitionist movement, because people recognized, as we should recognize today, that forcibly breaking up families is a horrible trauma, a damage to individuals, families, and communities, and a form of oppression. It also shows that the 13th and 14th Amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments, were passed explicitly, according to the hearings and the statements of people in Congress at the time, to end forcible family separation and forcible childbearing. So the idea in Dobbs that the Reconstruction Amendments don't preserve and protect reproductive autonomy is absolutely wrong. It's absolutely ahistorical. Now, after slavery was abolished, there continued to be this idea that Black women were incapable of caring for children without white people's supervision. For example, this book, The Plantation Negro as a Freeman by Philip Bruce, made the argument that in freedom, Black women neglected their children and shouldn't have authority over their children. And these ideas, I don't have time to go into all of them, but if you think about some of the dominant negative stereotypes about Black women. They have to do with how neglectful we are to our children, how much we don't really care about our children, what reckless parents and childbearers we are. And the idea that Black women's childbearing itself is a biological threat to Black communities, to their families, to the nation. It's a social problem that needs social policies to address it. This is so prevalent. I think it's one of the dominant forces behind unjust social policies in the United States. And just one example of that is the icon, the myth of the Black welfare queen who was supposed to have children just to get a welfare check and then spend the money on herself because she didn't care for her children and rip off hardworking American taxpayers. As I'll mention again a little bit later, this was the image that fueled the end of the federal guarantee to welfare and the massive, so-called welfare reform or welfare restructuring that took place in the 1990s. This is a very common image of Black mothers that is powerful enough to steer social policy in America. Another consequence or impact of the notion that Black mothers are reckless childbearers was the forced sterilization of Black women throughout the 1960s and 1970s en masse. The eugenics board in North Carolina even continued until 1973, and by that point was primarily sterilizing Black mothers on welfare. We know that these kinds of policies continue and are targeted at Black and Brown women because of some of the exposés that have come out recently. For example, the expose, which was documented in the documentary Belly of the Beast, that in California, Black and Latina women who were incarcerated there were survivors of a policy to sterilize them against their will. And another story was when a Black nurse became a whistleblower about forced sterilizations in Georgia immigration detention facility. These images also supported the prosecutions of Black mothers for having babies. Uh, in the late 1980s, extending into the 1990s, hundreds of Black mothers were prosecuted for giving birth and using drugs. I say it that way because they weren't just prosecuted for using drugs while pregnant, they were prosecuted for having babies and using drugs. And one of the reasons I say this is because you have to ask why a public health problem of drug use during pregnancy became a crime. And you also have to ask how these prosecutions of Black women led to fetal protection policies that go beyond them. And that's because they put in place this idea that pregnant people could be prosecuted for their actions during pregnancy that were seen to risk a fetus. This is the basis of the genesis of my book, Killing the Black Body, because I began writing and advocating in opposition to these prosecutions. And that led me to think about all the practices and policies from the time of slavery to the present that target Black women and punish them for their childbearing decisions. Uh, Once the prosecutions began in the late 1980s, it led to a more wide-scale criminalization of pregnancy, including prosecuting women for stillbirths and miscarriages. The first one was against a Black woman, Regina McKnight, who had a stillbirth and was charged with homicide by child abuse on grounds that her use of drugs caused the stillbirth. Again, radical change in policy. Before this, pregnant people were not being prosecuted for stillbirths and miscarriages. This was a policy that began on the backs of Black women and was linked then to the assault on abortion care, extending it to not only punishing people for having abortions, but punishing them for any bad outcome to a pregnancy on grounds that they had harmed a fetus. And so Regina McKnight ended up being sentenced to 20 years in prison once she was convicted. And she spent 8 years in prison until she was able to get a lawyer to advocate strenuously for her and present a case of ineffective assistance of counsel because her lawyer did not do an adequate job challenging the bogus testimony that the state put on that she had caused the stillbirth, and her conviction was overturned. Now, a recent report by Pregnancy Justice called Pregnancy as a Crime, a preliminary report on the first year after Dobbs, showed that at least 210, there have been at least 210 criminal cases since the Dobbs decision between June 24th, 2022 and June 23rd, 2023, I should say in the first year. There have been more since then that charge pregnant people with crimes related to pregnancy, pregnancy loss, or birth. In other words, we saw, again, beginning with the prosecutions of Black women, an expansion of the criminalization of pregnancy beyond criminalizing abortion to criminalizing all sorts of conduct during pregnancy or related to pregnancy loss or birth. Now, I'm going to turn to another aspect of reproductive justice that relates to the story I told at the beginning, but connects the bans on abortion and the Dobbs decision, the criminalization of pregnancy, and family policing. And one way to see the connection is to think about this solution that was suggested by a majority of the US Supreme Court in the Dobbs argument and in the Dobbs decision. And that is that there's no problem to banning abortion, compelling people to give birth, because all they have to do is give up their baby for adoption. And both during the Dobbs oral argument and in the Dobbs decision, uh, initially Justice Amy Coney Barrett, and then in the Dobbs decision written by Justice Alito, they mention this solution to compelling people to have babies, to give birth against their will through abortion bans and restrictions. And in the Alito's Dobbs decision, he says that all you have to do is turn over your baby to a safe haven, and you can rest assured that they will find a suitable home for your baby. And then he drops a footnote referring to a report that said that there were not enough adoptable babies to meet the demand for babies to adopt. So he posited this kind of win-win solution that solves the problem of forced pregnancies and births and also solves the problem of people who want to adopt babies. You know, the very market-based answer. And I'm sure we can all think of all sorts of reasons why it is, not just an a false answer, but also an unjust one. It doesn't relate at all to the 9 months that someone's carrying this pregnancy. Doesn't relate at all to the fact that most people who wanted an abortion but couldn't get one do not put their babies up for adoption. And it gives a false picture of what happens to children in the foster system. Because if you surrender your baby to the state, we're not talking about private adoptions. He's saying drop them off at a safe haven. That means the state is going to take custody of this baby. Most babies who are in state custody are put into the foster system. And that is not the happy solution that Alito posited in the opinion. In fact, the family policing system is a violent system. It is a system that does not give voluntary care to abandoned children. It operates on accusing parents who want and love their children with mostly, as I said before, accusations of neglect, which are usually related to poverty. And most of the children who are taken from their families in America are impoverished or low income. And as I mentioned already, disproportionately Black and Indigenous children. Once they are accused, and the accusations can come from anonymous calls to a child abuse hotline. So you don't know who's accusing you. You don't know anything about the truth or accuracy of this accusation. The families are investigated. Well, actually, first, most of the cases are not followed up on because they just sound absurd. But then there are still, because there are millions and millions of accusations that come into the child abuse hotlines across the country, there still are hundreds of thousands, I mean, millions of families who are investigated every year. Now, most of those investigations lead to what's called unsubstantiated cases, because again, there's no evidence that these families are actually harming their children. But the investigation itself is extremely traumatic. This means that strangers are coming into your home, sometimes with police officers, looking to find evidence that you have harmed your child. And they interrogate family members. They search without a search warrant, which they should have. The Constitution demands it, but they rarely do it. They search your home, every corner of the home, cabinets, refrigerators, dressers, under the bed, every part of your home. If they come in the middle of the night, which sometimes they do, to catch everybody at home, they remove children from their beds. They may strip search them. Often they strip search children, even if the accusation has nothing to do with child abuse, apart from their families. Just imagine the trauma to a child of being taken out of bed with strangers they've never seen before, stripping them down to examine their bodies, interrogating them about their families. They collect private data from school systems, hospital systems, anywhere, social service systems about you. And then they threaten you with taking your children. In many cases, hundreds of thousands of cases every year, they take the children away and put them in a system that we know it's well documented is harmful to children. So that's why I call it a family policing system. Okay, I've already mentioned who they target. Uh, the roots of family policing, I've mentioned, go all the way back to the institution of slavery, but more specifically, the actual system of courts ordering children to be separated from their families and placed in the care of others, we can trace literally to the apprenticeship system that after emancipation sent tens of thousands of Black children back to the so-called care of former enslavers, which was actually a way of forcing them to work for former white enslavers uh, on grounds that their parents were neglecting them. And uh, child, the child welfare system, or I should say child removal initially was seen as a weapon of war with the government, the military, taking Native children en masse from tribes that were being attacked by the federal military in order to decimate the tribes. Now, that policy turned into an official child welfare policy as part of the child welfare system in America of removing Native children on grounds of neglect and placing them in boarding schools, orphanages run by white people, and in white adoptive homes. And you may have read very recently, last year, maybe it was earlier this year, that the US government issued an apology for that. They have not given reparations as the Canadian government has done to tribes that were harmed by these policies of child removal. I'd also led more recently this way of thinking about how to meet the needs of impoverished, struggling families in America led to carceral policies that increased the buildup of prisons and police officers in Black communities, restructured welfare by ending the federal entitlement to welfare, placing all sorts of limits on the receipt of welfare, and also a third law that is less well known, the Adoption Safe Families Act, which was intended to deal with the massive numbers of Black children who've been taken from their families and put in the foster system. At the time this act was passed, most of the children in the US foster care system were Black children. Just think about that. Black children are a small minority of children in the United States, and yet they were the ones that were the most likely to be taken from their home at such high rates that they were, I should have said almost half. They were almost half of children in foster care. And the way of dealing with that was not to question their being taken from their families, but to speed up termination of parental rights and give states incentives to have children adopted after their parents' rights were ended. Uh, this system runs by carceral surveillance. I've mentioned police officers several times, so I won't say more about that. But I do want to highlight the role of what are called mandated reporters, professionals who have contact with children, like teachers, doctors, social service providers, social workers, are what's called mandated reporters. They're supposed to report to the authorities, to child welfare agencies, their suspicions of abuse and neglect of children. And many people think this is a good thing, but what it does is take people who are trained to care for children and instead of encouraging them to provide that care, encouraging them to turn the children over to a harmful system. It also encourages them not to see what the families actually need, but to report suspicions. And their suspicions, we know, are highly racially biased. One example is that Black pregnant women are much more likely to be tested for drug use and reported to child welfare agencies. And agencies are increasingly entering into multi-million-dollar contracts with data surveillance companies to collect massive amounts of data on low-income families and then create digital predictive analytics to predict risks to children, which have been shown to do a terrible job at it. Um, because this is GER, I want to highlight also what I call the price of kinship care. Grandmothers and grandfathers, more so grandmothers, but it's also grandfathers, play a big part of what's called kinship care. This is when states, instead of sending children to strangers, which is harmful to children to send them to strangers, it's better to keep children in the family. They are increasingly turning, especially with Black children, to grandparents to care for these children. But there's a high price that is paid for it. Because if the grandparents, in order to get support, financial support to help them care for these grandchildren, if they become licensed foster caregivers, they are now regulated by the state. And that means that anything they do that the state thinks is not up to standards, and this can mean not having enough dressers in the home. It can mean not feeding the children the meals that the state says they should be feeding them. It can even mean allowing the parents to see the children in unsupervised visits. And so that means that the state can come in and I don't have time now. Maybe in Q&A I can tell the story, to come in and take the children from the grandparents on grounds that there's not enough room in the apartment or some other, it can be a minuscule violation that the state finds. And in my opinion, grandparents should just be provided the income they need to care for these children instead of having to give up custody, legal custody to the state, which now means that the state can police them in ways that can lead to really horrible breakups of the family. Okay, I'm gonna, so that I can leave about 15 minutes for Q&A, I'm gonna jump to my ending, which is that I and many, well, a growing number of grassroots organizations and policy centers are calling for dismantling this harmful system and replacing it by reimagining care and safety for children. And I've just put up some of the work we've been doing. One is to end involuntary, uninformed drug and infant testing. Drug testing by doctors should be done for the patient, not to accuse the patient of harm that is going to lead to separation of their newborn from them. We're working on getting states, especially New York State, to recognize that the Fourth Amendment requires that state agents that come into your home have to have a warrant, which, as I said, is almost never applied in the case of child welfare investigations. We're trying to end mandated reporting because it causes so much harm. It deters families from getting help, does not provide help for families. And also, if a doctor, a caseworker, a teacher believes that there is urgent, immediate harm to a child that they cannot address and no one else can address, they can always call the child abuse hotline. They don't need to be a mandated reporter to do that. And we're also developing ways of providing the care that communities need in their communities, like mutual aid approaches and transformative justice approaches that provide more effective ways of addressing violence that does occur in families, but that this system does not address. So I'm going to end there to leave some time for Q&A, and I'm happy to answer questions and engage in comments or however you'd like the discussion to go.
Perfect. So we do have a question, but before we get to that question, Dorothy, so when I was listening to you talk about this, a couple of things were coming to my head. One, I just finished reading this book called Seeking Shelter, A Working
Mhm.
Mother, Her Children, and a Story of Homelessness in America. And she was a brown woman, and she did whatever she could to avoid the child
Yeah.
welfare system. And so people don't realize how harmful it is. I've worked in that system. They don't realize
Mhm.
how harmful that system is. So that's one thing to really lift up. But
Yeah.
just listening to you talk about this thing, I was like the intersectionality of, this child welfare system, the Black maternal health issues that we're having
Mhm.
currently today, the government talking about paying women $5,000 to have babies. All these things
Mhm.
just are running through my head when you're talking about
Yes.
this. And do you have any thoughts
Yeah.
about any of that?
Yeah. So first, thank you for raising the question of homelessness and families, mothers and children who, again, I don't mean to leave out the fathers, but uh, typically in many of these cases, the mother is the primary caretaker of the children and is the one the child welfare system is targeting. If anything, they often ignore the father. So when fathers are involved in the children's lives, they often ignore that. And I've been involved in cases where fathers have had to fight to get their children from not being adopted because the mothers, in fact, I'm involved right now. I signed on to an amicus brief of a father who was denied custody of the child on grounds that he didn't keep the mother from using drugs while she was pregnant. So the mother's rights were terminated, and they wanted to adopt the child away from this father who was caring for the children on grounds that he was responsible for the mother's drug use. Okay. Now,
Oh,
conversely, there are so many cases where the mother is is surviving intimate partner violence, leaves with the children. She doesn't have anywhere to go but a homeless shelter. The homeless shelter calls the child abuse hotline. They come in and take the children away and tell the mother you can only get your children back when you have a place to stay. Now, what do you think this does? It encourages her to go back to the abusive partner because at
mhm.
least then she was able to keep with her children. And I quote in my book, Torn Apart, a mother who says, I should have just let him beat me because then I could have kept my children. I mean, what
Mm,
kind of sick system is this? It
right.
doesn't protect the children from the violence. It encourages it. It
Yeah,
encourages it. So there's that. Now, these contradictions that come up, what kind of country do we live in where we don't address childhood poverty? In fact, right now, every time I turn on the news, right now the debate in Congress is about cutting Medicaid,
hmm,
which is the main way that impoverished families can get medical care for their children. So we have a nation that, and we knew that when during the COVID lockdown, when families were getting actual checks to help them support their families, child poverty went down.
exactly.
Children were better protected then. And yet what happens? Congress ends that program and child poverty goes up. So we have a nation where we have the highest rate of child poverty in the Western world. We take away more children than any other nation in the world. We have the worst health care of any Western nation. We have a higher maternal maternal mortality rate than some countries we consider developing nations,
Mhm.
right? And then there's the talk about giving incentives to have children while we're taking hundreds of thousands of children away from families every year. It's total contradiction, and we still have evidence of sterilization abuse going on.
Yeah, yeah,
So I say that when you have contradictions like that, it means that something is fundamentally wrong. Do you know what I
exactly.
mean? Something is
Yeah.
fundamentally wrong. These systems are backward. They're backward.
Yeah.
And that's all the more reason why we need to radically reimagine how we meet human needs in this nation, how we care for people, how we keep children safe.
Yeah. Thank you for that. There is a question in the Q&A. Do you have any advice for people who are required to be a mandated reporter as part of their jobs?
Yeah. Well, it's a tough situation because people are afraid if I don't report, I might get fired, I might lose my license, I might be penalized in some other way. And so, uh, what are you supposed to do if it's a condition of your job to be a mandated reporter? So, one thing, one thing to point out is, well, people who serve wealthy children and parents do not report their clients and patients for what they report impoverished families for. We absolutely know this. And, uh, uh, I like to say all you have to do is read the memoir of any wealthy white person in America, and they'd say something about how their parents abused them, traumatized them. I've been reading memoirs, so I'm telling you.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knew. Everybody knew what was going on. Their doctors knew because they often have anorexia or some eating disorder or a mental, they've attempted suicide. Everyone knows they do not report them. So it is absolutely false to say that we have universal mandated reporting in the United States. We have mandated reporting for impoverished low-income families, especially if they're Black and brown. Okay, that's and Native. That's the truth. And it's undeniable.
Mhm.
Okay, but that's still, there's still the question, what do I do? Well, one thing we have to do is advocate for ending it. I talk to a lot of doctors, they don't like this system because they feel like it's tying their hands, and they want to get help for their patients, and then they find out the child was removed, and so many of them, I didn't mean for the child to be removed. I meant for them to get food. I meant for them to get clothing or housing. And then they find out that's not what the system does. It takes the children away. So I have been encouraging doctors and others as well, social workers. There's a movement now to end this by the very people who are forced to do it because they know it's it's not helping the families. I think it's insulting to professionals who are way better at caring for children than who they're turning the children over to.
Mhm.
And then the other thing is to advocate for ending the training because the training tells you to report any suspicion. It shouldn't just be a suspicion. You should have evidence that the child is being harmed in the home. It shouldn't just be your suspicion because that's going to lead to an investigation that you may not have wanted to happen at all. And so, if there were better training, again, short of ending mandated reporting altogether, but training that says first, there should be evidence that the child was actually harmed in the home. And second, you should investigate whether there's a way you can handle it without going to the child welfare system. So those are just
Yeah.
some ways of addressing it. But I recognize it's a tough situation to be in, but
Yeah.
all the more reason we need to address it. And it's
Exactly.
professionals who can do it. Yeah.
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 Thank you. And thank you for lifting that up. And even just talking briefly about how white families are not people they don't do mandated reporting to white
Oh,
privileged families. They don't do
English
that. I mean, you
family.
can look at, and people will probably not, they're not even thinking about this, but even like, for example, Drew Barrymore, when I'm reading her story and I'm like, she was in a club at 9 years old drinking alcohol, that's child abuse. And nobody, and she went on to become somebody famous and people just read her story, but there was
Exactly.
nobody reporting her mother.
Exactly. There's a book that was on the New York Times bestseller list for like 2 years. I'm glad my mom died, by the young actress who played
Mhm.
was in iCarly, and because they wanted her to remain looking like a little girl, her mother basically was starving her.
Yep,
And everybody knew that. And she knew it, and nobody did anything about it.
exactly.
So, we could go on. I know,
Yes, we
Kayla,
could.
we could go on with Demi Moore, her mother prostituting her out, to a man she was seeing. I won't go down the list.
Yeah,
So many. I swear to
it's a
you,
lot.
every single book I read, there is child, or even if we take something minor, like a child straying away from home. Most parents have some incident where a child ran away. I know for me, it was my son running away in the airport, but running out of the house, running down the street. In a wealthy neighborhood, if that happens, the police help you find your child and bring the child home. In an impoverished Black neighborhood, and I begin my book Torn Apart with a story like this, you can get a ticket for child abuse. And I talk about a mother whose son ran from the after her cousin into the parking lot. A stranger picked him up and called the police. The mother is standing there. That's my son. Give him to me. She wouldn't give. The police officer gave her a ticket for child abuse. And she was studying to be a nurse. She cannot get a job as a nurse. She can't get an apartment because she's in the registry in Colorado as a child abuser because she could see her son in front of her, in
Yeah,
front of her. I mean, be, yeah, so I always say, let's be honest about this because, yes, it's true that most of the families whose children are taken are struggling and they do need something. But there's also a whole lot of cases where there's absolutely no difference between what the parents did. I mean, sometimes it's worse in the wealthy families.
yeah,
And
exactly.
it's only because of this image that they must, they're still better off in their wealthy family than in foster care. Like the doctors would never think, or teachers. Foster care is for impoverished Black, and brown and
Hmm.
Native and
Hmm.
impoverished white children. Yes, there's also those families as well, but it's not seen as something for privileged white people. And that's just wrong. That's wrong. That's
Right.
unjust.
Professor Roberts, this has been amazing. We
Thank
can talk
you.
for hours.
I
We
gotta
can
keep
talk for
going. I have a board meeting at 2, another board I'm supposed to be getting to now.
So thank you so much for joining us. We didn't get to all the questions, but
Yeah.
hopefully we will have another conversation in the future with
Yes.
you. We appreciate you so much. Thank you for sharing this information. Thank you everyone in the audience for being here to take part in this lunchtime lecture session, and we'll have the recording available. So thank you, Professor Roberts.
Great. Oh, Gayla, one more thing. Let people know about my book, Torn Apart,
Talk
because
about it.
yeah, well, it's called Torn Apart, How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World. Maybe after I exit, you can put it in the chat or something, because I document everything I have told you. And so, sometimes people say that I can't believe, are
Yeah,
real most of the children in there for neglect. So I just don't have the, oh, thank you. I don't have the,
put it
yes,
in.
that's it. Thank you so much. Okay.
And
If,
we'll make sure that everybody that RSVP'd for this, that even didn't come, that they get this information as well
yeah,
as the
thank you.
recording.
Thank you. Because lots of notes with
Oh,
sources
oh,
to it.
okay, perfect. Thank
Okay.
you, Professor
All right.
Roberts. Thank you for your
Thanks.
time. We appreciate you.
Sure. Take
Okay,
care. I
bye-bye.
appreciate you too. Take
Okay,
care. Bye.
bye-bye.
Bye.